In the winter of 1878, a discovery that would haunt the Methodist community for generations was made by a substitute teacher in Cedar Creek, Indiana. From the town's most beloved Sunday school program, 50 children had vanished over 2 years. These were children whose names appeared in attendance records, but whose families seemed to have forgotten they ever existed. A horror so systematic that local authorities suppressed the evidence for decades would be revealed by what she found hidden beneath the church floorboards. Tonight, the truth about Cedar Creek's most protected secret is what we uncover. The story of Margaret Wilson and the children who trusted her with their lives we will continue with shortly, but this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest corners of America's religious history. If you're ready to hear stories that few channels dare to tell, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. The courage to discover what really happened in that Methodist church basement, do you have it? Not just individual evil, but an entire community's willingness to look away when faced with inconvenient truths would be exposed by the investigation that followed, along with a criminal network that had been operating across the Midwest for over a decade. In the heart of Indiana's coal country was where Cedar Creek sat, where Methodist faith ran as deep as the mine shafts honeycombing the earth beneath. Nearly 3,000 souls were boasted by the town by 1876, most of them God-fearing families drawn by promises of steady work in the expanding rail yards and coal operations that connected Indiana's resources to Chicago's hungry markets. What had been a sleepy farming community was transformed when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad reached Cedar Creek in 1871, turning it into a bustling hub of commerce and industry. Challenges that tested the social fabric of traditional rural life were brought by the town's rapid growth. Weekly, Irish and German immigrants arrived, seeking work in the mines and rail yards, their Catholic and Lutheran faiths creating tensions with the established Protestant majority. Not just for souls, but for social influence in a community where religious affiliation often determined business opportunities and social standing, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian congregations competed. The community's crown jewel was the First Methodist Church, a magnificent structure of Indiana limestone with twin bell towers that could be heard for miles across the rolling farmland. The most modern religious facility in Hamilton County was marked by its Gothic Revival architecture, stained glass windows imported from Cincinnati, and steam heating system. Completed in 1874 with donations from prosperous merchants and mine owners, the building represented Methodist aspirations to cultural leadership in the rapidly changing town. Packed pews and children's voices raised in hymn meant Sunday mornings in Cedar Creek. But it was the church's Sunday school program that truly set First Methodist apart from neighboring congregations. A stern-faced woman of 42 who'd arrived from Pennsylvania 5 years prior, Margaret Wilson, was the leader under whom the program had grown from a handful of local children to over 200 participants from surrounding counties. From as far as 20 miles away, parents brought their children, enduring difficult wagon rides over muddy roads to participate in what had become legendary throughout central Indiana. Through a combination of biblical knowledge, unwavering discipline, and an apparent gift for transforming even the most unruly children into model citizens, Margaret Wilson commanded respect. Experience with children from diverse backgrounds had been given to her by her background teaching in Philadelphia's industrial schools, and she seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to reach young minds regardless of their family circumstances or natural abilities. A soft-spoken woman of 38 who'd never married, her assistant Sarah Coleman, seemed to possess an almost magical ability to calm even the most restless child with her gentle voice and patient manner. 2 years after Margaret's arrival, Sarah had joined the program. She came from a Methodist mission in Cincinnati, where she'd worked with orphaned children. Her references were impeccable, and her dedication to the children's welfare appeared absolute. A prosperous businessman in his 50s, Robert Hayes, who donated generously to expand the church's educational facilities, supervised them together. Interests in 3 coal mines, 2 grain elevators, and the town's largest general store were owned by Hayes. His appointment to the church board had been unanimous, and his financial contributions had funded not just building improvements, but also the innovative educational programs that were drawing families from across the region. The special biblical excursions, educational trips that combined scripture study with visits to historical sites across Indiana and neighboring states, were what made Cedar Creek's Sunday school legendary throughout Hamilton County. These weren't simple afternoon outings, but elaborate week-long journeys that promised to bring Bible stories to life through visits to museums, historical churches, archaeological sites, and even meetings with prominent Methodist educators and missionaries. Through word of mouth and occasional articles in Methodist publications that praised Cedar Creek's innovative approach to religious education, the program's reputation had grown. Throughout the region, parents competed to have their children selected for these prestigious expeditions, which were presented as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities for young minds to expand beyond the limitations of rural life. Not just acceptable but celebrated throughout Protestant America were such programs, thanks to the Methodist denomination's emphasis on education and social improvement. The importance of learning and personal development had been emphasized by John Wesley's founding principles, so Methodist churches were expected to provide educational opportunities that went beyond simple Bible study. An extraordinary opportunity for families of modest means was represented by the promise of educational travel in an era when most children received minimal formal schooling. To the program's appeal, Margaret Wilson's reputation for transforming wayward children into model citizens only added. With letters of recommendation from Methodist leaders in Philadelphia, she had arrived in Cedar Creek, where her work in industrial schools had gained recognition for reducing juvenile delinquency in some of the city's most challenging neighborhoods. Perfectly suited to the needs of a frontier community struggling with the social changes brought by rapid industrial development seemed her methods, which emphasized discipline combined with expanded horizons. Perfect had been the timing of the program's establishment. The Panic of 1873 had left many families struggling financially, making the promise of educational opportunities for their children particularly attractive. A way to give their children advantages they could never provide themselves was how parents who could barely afford basic necessities saw Margaret Wilson's program. Additional legitimacy and moral authority were given to them by the fact that these opportunities came through the church. The town's most successful citizens, mine owners, merchants, railroad officials, and prosperous farmers were included in Cedar Creek's Methodist congregation, whose support lent credibility to any church-sponsored activity. It became almost impossible for other parents to express doubts or concerns without appearing ungrateful or suspicious of beneficial community initiatives when such respected community members endorsed the educational program and spoke proudly of their own children's participation. Gradual but deliberate had been the program's expansion beyond Cedar Creek. With Methodist churches in smaller surrounding communities, Margaret Wilson had established contacts, offering to include their children in the excursions as a service to rural families who lacked access to such educational opportunities. Not only did this regional approach increase the pool of potential participants, but it also made it more difficult for any single community to track patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities. In September 1876, the first disappearance occurred, though no one called it a disappearance at the time. A special excursion to study ancient biblical practices at a newly discovered archaeological site near Louisville had been selected for 8-year-old Timothy Morrison. With grateful nods and tears of joy, his parents, recent German immigrants who spoke limited English and worked in Hayes's newest coal mine, received Margaret Wilson's explanation. In his brief months attending Sunday school, Timothy had shown exceptional promise, demonstrating an unusual ability to memorize scripture and ask thoughtful questions about biblical stories. That his intellectual gifts had come to the attention of a Methodist family in Kentucky who specialized in biblical archaeology and ancient studies was explained by Margaret Wilson. They had specifically requested a bright young student to assist with their research while receiving advanced education that would prepare him for possible missionary work or religious scholarship. As a rare honor that reflected not just Timothy's abilities, but the quality of Cedar Creek's educational program, the opportunity was presented. Regular reports on their son's progress would be received by the Morrison family, and after 2 years, Timothy would return with knowledge and connections that could transform his life prospects. For parents who had immigrated to America, hoping to give their children better opportunities than they had known in Germany, the offer seemed like an answer to their prayers. Barely in the community consciousness did Timothy's departure register. Proud rather than concerned seemed the Morrison family, and even skeptical neighbors were convinced by Margaret Wilson's detailed letter explaining the opportunity that the boy had simply been blessed with an extraordinary chance for advancement. Less noticeable among his peer group was the fact that Timothy had always been somewhat quiet and studious, making his absence. 2 weeks later, an excursion focused on missionary work among distant communities was joined by 10-year-old Mary Catherine Phillips. Assurances that Mary Catherine would be learning valuable skills while helping to establish Sunday schools in newly settled territories were received by her widowed mother, who struggled to support 3 children on the small income from taking in laundry. Not just reasonable, but inevitable seemed the girl's selection because of her obvious intelligence and leadership qualities. One of the most popular children in the Sunday school program had been Mary Catherine, known for her ability to help younger children with their lessons and her enthusiastic participation in all activities. That a Methodist mission organization in Illinois had specifically requested a capable young girl to assist with their work among families moving west was explained by Margaret Wilson. Training in teaching methods would be received by Mary Catherine while helping to spread Methodist education to frontier communities that lacked established churches. The suggestion that Mary Catherine's experience could lead to a position as a professional teacher or missionary accompanied the promise of regular correspondence and eventual return. Careers that would provide financial security and social respectability far beyond what her current circumstances might offer. To a widow facing an uncertain future, the opportunity seemed like divine providence. By Christmas of 1876, on various educational expeditions, 6 more children had departed. The same careful pattern was followed by each departure: selection based on demonstrated merit, detailed explanations of educational opportunities, promises of correspondence that somehow never quite materialized, and reassurances that any lack of communication simply reflected the children's deep immersion in their studies. A calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development was what made this systematic disappearance possible. In its exploitation of parental aspirations and social expectations lay the genius of Margaret Wilson's system. The chance for a child to advance through church connections represented a family's greatest hope in a community where educational opportunity was scarce and upward mobility rare. Not just ungrateful, but potentially damaging to other children's prospects within the program would have seemed to question such opportunities. As Ellen Hartwell would later discover, a calculated methodology that had nothing to do with educational merit or spiritual development was what the selection of children for the excursions followed. A systematic approach to identifying the most vulnerable and valuable candidates for their criminal enterprise had been developed by Margaret Wilson and Sarah Coleman. Family circumstances that would make disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigation were the focus of their primary criteria. Children from immigrant families were preferred because language barriers and cultural differences made parents less likely to question authority figures or navigate complex inquiries about their children's whereabouts. Particularly valuable were recent arrivals to the community because they lacked established social networks that might notice and investigate unexplained absences. A crucial role in the selection process was played by economic desperation. More likely to be grateful for opportunities and less likely to ask difficult questions that might jeopardize their children's apparent good fortune were families struggling financially. Considered ideal candidates were widowed mothers, large families with limited resources, and parents working in dangerous occupations that could leave children orphaned at any time. Based on their potential market value in the criminal networks that Margaret Wilson had cultivated over years of careful development were the children themselves evaluated. Destined for industrial work in factories and mines were younger boys with strong builds, where their small size and developing strength could be exploited without immediate health consequences. Premium prices in domestic service markets that Ellen would later learn extended far beyond legitimate household employment were commanded by older girls with pleasant appearances and basic education. A liability in some cases was intelligence actually considered, as brighter children were more likely to resist indoctrination, attempt escape, or find ways to communicate with their families. Children who were bright enough to be valuable, but compliant enough to be manageable were preferred by Margaret Wilson. An excellent laboratory for observing children's personalities and identifying those most suitable for different types of exploitation was provided by the Sunday school program. Crucial proved Sarah Coleman's role in this evaluation process. Access to intimate details about their fears, hopes, and family relationships was given to her by her gentle manner and obvious affection for the children. She would spend hours in private conversation with potential candidates, ostensibly providing pastoral care and educational guidance, but actually gathering intelligence that would determine their ultimate fate. A significant expansion in the scope of the operation was marked by the winter of 1876–77. Throughout Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, Margaret Wilson had established connections with similar programs in Methodist churches, creating a regional network that could move children across state lines and make tracking infinitely more difficult. To coincide with increased railroad connectivity that made long-distance travel both easier and less conspicuous, this expansion had been carefully planned. Invaluable in facilitating this expansion proved Robert Hayes's business connections. Throughout the Midwest, his involvement in railroad shipping and grain trading had given him contacts, many of whom were willing to assist with discreet transportation arrangements in exchange for favorable business terms. Possible to move children across multiple states without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or railroad officials was made by the legitimate cover provided by his various enterprises. All expectations had been exceeded by the financial returns from the operation, generating enough revenue to fund significant expansions of the church's facilities and educational programs. From the conspirators' perspective, a virtuous cycle was created by this. Their criminal profits funded improvements that attracted more families and provided better cover for their activities. Their operations were facilitated by the new church basement facilities funded by Hayes's donations, which included private rooms and storage areas. By spring 1877, from over 12 different communities, the program was handling children, with some families traveling more than 30 miles to participate in Cedar Creek's renowned educational offerings. Virtually impossible for any single community to notice patterns or maintain oversight of the program's activities was made by this geographic spread. Parents in different towns rarely communicated with each other, and questioning that might seem to challenge the program's integrity was discouraged by the prestige associated with selection for the excursions. But someone far more calculating than anyone suspected would prove to be the true architect of this deception. From criminal networks in major cities who were eager to establish reliable sources for child labor, the success of the operation attracted attention. Through underground channels, Margaret Wilson's reputation for delivering healthy, educated, and properly conditioned children had spread, leading to advanced orders and premium pricing that transformed what had begun as opportunistic crime into systematic human trafficking. The psychological sophistication that made the operation possible was revealed by Sarah Coleman's personal journal, which Ellen Hartwell would eventually discover. Unlike Margaret Wilson, whose motivations appeared primarily financial, a disturbing fascination with the process of psychological manipulation itself was demonstrated by Sarah. Like clinical studies in human behavior, read her detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses. Disturbing passages about conditioning children for their eventual destinations were contained in the journal. Techniques for gradually separating children from family attachments, identifying which children would adapt best to different types of work, and developing strategies to prevent rebellion or escape attempts had been developed by Sarah. A calculating assessment of their commercial potential and psychological vulnerabilities was masked by her apparent affection for the children. One particularly chilling entry described her work with 12-year-old Anna Kowalski, whose selection for a special missionary training program had been celebrated by her Polish immigrant parents as divine blessing. How she had gradually convinced Anna that her family's poverty and foreign background made them unsuitable guardians for a child with such exceptional spiritual gifts was detailed in Sarah's notes. Convinced that serving God required her to abandon her former life entirely had been Anna by the time she departed for her supposed missionary training. Beyond individual manipulation to encompass systematic deception of the broader community extended Sarah's methods. A carefully managed correspondence system that created the illusion of ongoing contact with departed children while actually providing no genuine communication at all had been crafted by her. Periodic updates written in Sarah's hand, but supposedly dictated by their children describing progress in their studies and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were received by parents. Multiple purposes were served by these fabricated letters. They reassured parents and prevented persistent inquiries that might lead to investigation. Seemingly innocent explanations for the children's continued absence and apparent reluctance to return home were provided by them. Most importantly, a paper trail that could be used to justify the program's activities if questions were ever raised by outside authorities was created by them. To her, relationships with other adults in the community extended the sophistication of Sarah's psychological manipulation. Key individuals whose support was crucial for maintaining the program's reputation had been identified by her, and specific strategies for managing each relationship had been developed. Detailed profiles of community leaders, noting their personal ambitions, family vulnerabilities, and business interests that could be leveraged to maintain their cooperation, were contained in her journal. In January 1878, the regular teaching staff was struck by tragedy when Sarah Coleman fell ill with what the local doctor diagnosed as consumption. Particularly unfortunate was the timing, as the program was preparing for its most ambitious series of excursions yet, a coordinated effort that would place nearly 30 children in various locations across the Midwest before the spring planting season made travel more difficult. A crisis for the operation was created by Sarah's illness. Irreplaceable in the short term was her intimate knowledge of each child's psychological profile and her carefully cultivated relationships with parents. Overwhelmed by administrative duties that had previously been shared, found Margaret Wilson herself. Despite the staffing shortage, Robert Hayes pressured her to maintain the program schedule. Based primarily on her recent graduation from the Indiana State Normal School and her impressive credentials as a trained educator, was the church board's decision to hire 24-year-old Ellen Hartwell as a temporary replacement. That Ellen's professional training had taught her the importance of detailed record-keeping and systematic educational assessment skills that would prove fatal to their carefully constructed deception was what the conspirators failed to anticipate. In southern Indiana, where her father served as a circuit preacher and her mother taught in various church schools, Ellen had grown up in a Methodist family. A desire to improve the quality of religious education available to rural children had been motivated by her decision to pursue formal education training. With genuine enthusiasm for the program's apparent innovations and high reputation throughout the Methodist community, she arrived in Cedar Creek. However, to notice discrepancies that others had overlooked would soon lead her by Ellen's professional training. Everything she had heard about the program's quality and effectiveness seemed to be confirmed by her first weeks in the position. Indeed, well-behaved, knowledgeable about scripture, and enthusiastic about their studies were the children who remained in regular attendance. Modern and well-equipped were the facilities, and evident in both financial contributions and parental participation was the community support for the program. But to look beyond surface appearances and evaluate educational programs based on measurable outcomes and systematic documentation had been taught to her by Ellen's professional training. Initially deflected by Margaret Wilson with explanations about the unique nature of their program and the confidential relationships they maintained with host families, were her requests to review assessment records, correspondence files, and long-term tracking data. When she attempted to prepare lesson plans that would build upon the previous year's curriculum, arose Ellen's first serious concerns. Impossible to ensure continuity in the education of their siblings and classmates who remained in the program was made by the absence of detailed records about what children had studied before their departure. That the departed children's studies had been so specialized that their curriculum bore little relationship to the regular Sunday school program was what she was told by Margaret Wilson when she raised these concerns. More troubling still, when Ellen casually mentioned some of the missing children in conversations with longtime church members, she was met with confused looks and vague responses. As if the community had collectively forgotten these young souls had ever existed, it was now seemed reluctant to discuss the subject at all, changing the conversation when Ellen attempted to ask about letters or updates from their absent children were parents who had once proudly spoken of their children's educational opportunities. Instruction in recognizing signs of educational fraud and institutional abuse had been included in Ellen's professional training, problems that were becoming increasingly common as demand for educational services outpaced the supply of qualified providers. Several warning signs she had been taught to identify were matched by the pattern she observed in Cedar Creek: vague record-keeping, reluctance to provide documentation, defensive responses to reasonable questions, and systematic isolation of program participants from outside oversight. In February 1878 came Ellen's first direct confrontation with Margaret Wilson. A letter to send to the families hosting the children on extended excursions had been prepared by Ellen, hoping to establish correspondence between the young students and their former classmates. Standard practice in legitimate educational exchange programs was such communication, serving important purposes in maintaining emotional connections and assessing student progress. Swift and severe was Margaret's reaction. The children's studies would be disrupted and their host's authority potentially undermined by such contact. Minimal outside interference to allow the students to fully immerse themselves in their new educational environments had been specifically requested by the families hosting the children. Forbidden from any communication regarding the absent students was Ellen, and warned that further interference could jeopardize her position and the program's carefully cultivated relationships. When she discovered that none of the churches or educational institutions supposedly hosting the children had ever heard of the Cedar Creek program, the substitute teacher's suspicions deepened. With polite but confused responses returned letters sent to Methodist congregations in cities where children had reportedly been placed. No record of Cedar Creek students or educational exchanges had anyone. A crucial turn took Ellen's investigation when she began examining the financial records associated with the educational program. That legitimate educational exchanges typically involved detailed financial arrangements, insurance considerations, and contractual agreements between participating institutions was understood by Ellen as a trained educator. Increasingly suspicious seemed the absence of such documentation in Cedar Creek's files. As straightforward philanthropy had Robert Hayes's role in financing the program always been presented, a successful businessman supporting community education through generous donations. But a more complex pattern of transactions that seemed inconsistent with simple charitable giving was revealed by Ellen's examination of church financial records. With no clear documentation of their purpose or destination, large sums of money moved in and out of program accounts. More troubling still were the personal financial changes Ellen observed in the program's leadership. Substantial property in Cedar Creek had been purchased by Margaret Wilson, and she was reportedly considering investments in California real estate. Despite her modest teacher's salary, Sarah Coleman had accumulated enough savings to afford extended medical treatment in Chicago. Significantly, Robert Hayes had expanded his business operations, opening new stores in neighboring towns and purchasing additional mining interests. Far beyond what their legitimate incomes could support seemed the collective wealth accumulation among the program's leadership. Familiarity with the typical financial circumstances of Methodist educators and church officials had been given to Ellen by her father's experience as a circuit preacher. Unprecedented in her experience and inconsistent with their supposed dedication to humble service was the prosperity displayed by Cedar Creek's educational leadership. A breaking point was reached by Ellen's growing unease when she overheard a conversation between Margaret Wilson and Robert Hayes in the church basement following a Wednesday evening service. Entirely inconsistent with educational programming seemed their hushed tones and frequent references to shipments, accounts, and contacts in Chicago. Like commercial transactions, then educational planning sounded the fragments of conversation she caught, suggesting coordination of transportation, discussion of prices, and concerns about maintaining schedules. On the night of March 15, 1878, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life was made by Ellen Hartwell. Using her key to the church educational wing, she entered the building long after evening services had concluded. Secrets she was determined to uncover were held by the basement rooms that served as Sunday school classrooms during winter months, regardless of the personal risk or professional consequences. A maze of shadows and strange sounds was the church basement at night. Mysterious noises were created by the building's steam heating system, and the winter wind rattled windows and doors throughout the structure. Barely enough light to navigate the familiar classrooms that seemed transformed and threatening in the darkness was provided by Ellen's single oil lamp. As she began her systematic search of Margaret Wilson's private office, her hands shook. Every assumption about the woman's character and motives was defied by what she found beneath a loose floorboard in Margaret Wilson's private office. Meticulous records spanning 2 full years were contained in a leather-bound ledger. But business transactions documented with the precision of a commercial enterprise and the cold calculation of systematic exploitation were what these weren't. Listed with their age, physical description, family background, and what Ellen gradually realized were sales prices was each missing child. Timothy Morrison, age 8, sturdy build, docile temperament, German family, limited English, had been sold for $85 to what the ledger cryptically referred to as Chicago textile interests. Mary Catherine Phillips, described as age 10, intelligent leadership qualities, widowed mother, financially desperate, commanded $120 from Louisville Domestic Services. More horrific grew the entries as Ellen read deeper into the ledger. By their perceived value in different markets were children categorized. To factories and mines went younger boys, where their small size and developing strength could be exploited. To domestic service that Ellen feared meant something far worse than legitimate housework went older girls. Along with coded references to contacts who could arrange transportation and provide documentation, the ledger contained addresses in Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. Most chilling of all were the financial summaries. Over $4,000 in documented revenue from the systematic sale of children had been generated over 2 years by Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes, more money than most Cedar Creek families would see in a lifetime. That this represented only the recorded transactions was suggested by additional notation, with hints of off-books arrangements that could have doubled or tripled their actual profits. An even darker picture of the operation's scope and sophistication was painted by additional evidence yielded by the basement. Forged letters supposedly written by the missing children, describing happy lives with their new families and expressing gratitude for the opportunities they were receiving, were discovered by Ellen. To any parent who became too persistent in their inquiries about their children's welfare, these carefully crafted deceptions had been shown. Clearly the work of one person creating fictional accounts of children's well-being was the handwriting, consistent across all the letters. Similar patterns were followed by the content, emphasizing how much the children were learning, how grateful they were for their opportunities, and how important it was that they focus on their studies without distractions from their previous lives. Specifically discouraged by several letters were parents from attempting to visit or maintain regular correspondence. What appeared to be contracts with various industrial operations and domestic service agencies was found by Ellen in a locked drawer. Carefully coded was the language, but unmistakable was the intent. Purchase agreements for child labor arranged through a network of accomplices who had turned human trafficking into a profitable business model were these. Delivery dates, payment terms, and even return policies for children who proved unsuitable for their intended work were specified by the contracts. In the form of correspondence between Margaret Wilson and her contacts in major cities came the most damning evidence. The specific requirements of various employers, their preferences for children of certain ages, their willingness to pay premium prices for particularly promising students, and their assurances of discretion in handling the arrangements were detailed in letters. Far beyond Indiana, with connections to similar operations in multiple states, was revealed a sophisticated network that extended. For the quality of merchandise she provided, a letter from a Chicago factory owner praised Margaret, noting that Cedar Creek children adapted well to industrial work and caused fewer problems than children acquired through other sources. For the next shipment, with detailed specifications for age ranges, physical capabilities, and personality traits that would be most suitable for the factory's operations, were included specific requests in the letter. Specifically, girls between ages 12 to 14 with pleasant demeanor and basic education was requested by another letter from what appeared to be a Louisville establishment Ellen did not fully comprehend. The horrific implications of such requests could not be disguised by the coded language, and Ellen realized that some of the children she had known and taught were likely trapped in situations far worse than industrial exploitation. Terrifyingly clear became the systematic nature of the operation as Ellen continued her investigation throughout the night. As an ideal hunting ground had been identified by Margaret Wilson, Cedar Creek's Methodist community, parents trusting enough to surrender their children, isolated enough to prevent easy investigation, and aspirational enough to believe in promises of educational advancement. Perfect cover for what amounted to systematic child trafficking was provided by the church's reputation and the educators' standing in the community. That the Cedar Creek operation was part of a much larger network spanning multiple states was revealed by the correspondence. With similar operations in Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, Margaret Wilson maintained regular contact, sharing information about successful techniques, profitable markets, and law enforcement risks. into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with specialized roles, established transportation routes, and coordinated timing that maximized profits while minimizing risks had the network evolved. To respond quickly to market demands and law enforcement pressures was allowed by regional coordination. Until the danger passed, children could be rapidly moved to other parts of the network if investigations threatened one location. That Cedar Creek had served as a temporary refuge for children from operations that had been compromised in other states while also sending its own victims to safer locations when local pressures increased was shown by the correspondence. But the discovery of Sarah Coleman's personal journal, hidden behind a false wall in the basement storage room, was perhaps most horrifying. As the operation's psychological architect revealed herself the gentle woman who had seemed so genuinely caring, whose detailed observations of each child's personality, fears, and weaknesses had been used to determine their market value and appropriate placement. Disturbing passages about methodically breaking down children's resistance and family attachments were contained in Sarah's journal. For different types of children, she had developed specific techniques: how to convince intelligent children that compliance was their only option, how to use religious instruction to create guilt and submission, and how to identify and exploit each child's deepest fears to ensure cooperation during the transition to their new circumstances. That Sarah's apparent illness was likely fabricated to provide cover for the operation's final phase was revealed by the journal. Actually, coordination with network partners to complete the largest transaction in the operation's history was her medical treatment in Chicago, a bulk sale of over 30 children to various industrial and domestic operations throughout the Midwest. That chilled her more than all the financial records and correspondence combined was something Ellen discovered hidden among Sarah's papers: fragmentary testimonies from children who had attempted to escape or communicate with their families. Apparently as insurance against network partners who might consider betraying the operation, these desperate messages had been intercepted and preserved. In a child's careful handwriting, one note read, "Mama, they told me you didn't want me anymore because I was bad. I work in the big building with the loud machines, my hands hurt all the time, and I'm so tired. Please come get me. I promise I'll be good." An address in Chicago and a notation indicating it had been intercepted before delivery was marked with the note. A girl's plea was contained in another fragment, apparently torn from a larger letter. "The lady here says I have to be grateful for my food and bed, but she makes me do things that feel wrong. I remember what you taught me about right and wrong, but she says God wants me to obey. I'm scared and I want to come home." As belonging to Mary Catherine Phillips was the handwriting identified in Sarah's careful notation. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical exploitation was revealed by these testimonies. That their families had abandoned them, that their suffering was deserved punishment for unspecified sins, and that submission to their circumstances was both inevitable and morally required were children systematically convinced. Into a tool for maintaining control and preventing resistance was perverted the religious framework that had initially attracted their families. As she continued reading through the horrific documentation, Ellen realized the conspirators were preparing to vanish entirely. That the children who had been sold were not just physically enslaved, but psychologically broken in ways that would make rescue and recovery extraordinarily difficult was realized by Ellen. The damage to their minds and spirits might never fully heal even if law enforcement could locate and free them. Far beyond the initial trafficking to encompass systematic psychological torture designed to destroy any hope of escape or recovery extended the true scope of the crime. That the three conspirators had been preparing to abandon Cedar Creek entirely by the summer of 1878, taking their accumulated profits to California, where they planned to establish themselves under new identities, was revealed by the financial records. To coincide with the completion of their largest transaction and the implementation of new railroad schedules that would facilitate rapid travel westward was the timing carefully calculated. Under an assumed name, Margaret Wilson had already purchased property near San Francisco, while Robert Hayes had been liquidating his Indiana business interests and converting assets to portable forms that could be easily transported. For her gradual withdrawal from community obligations and preparation for departure provided cover by Sarah Coleman's supposed illness. Their escape and early retirement in comfortable circumstances would have been funded by the final excursion, which would have netted them enough money. to detailed contingency preparations for various scenarios if their activities were discovered before their departure extended the plan's sophistication. They had prepared false documentation, established escape routes, and identified criminal contacts who could provide assistance in avoiding law enforcement. That they had even considered eliminating potential witnesses who might threaten their escape was shown by the correspondence. The urgency of her situation was revealed to Ellen by her discovery of these escape plans. A rapid abandonment that would leave their victims with no hope of rescue and no possibility of justice was what the conspirators were planning, not a gradual withdrawal. Potential disappearance into a criminal network that spanned the continent was what the 23 children scheduled for the upcoming excursion were facing, not just exploitation. A terrible burden of responsibility was created by the realization that she was probably the only person who knew the truth and had access to evidence. The permanent loss of nearly 24 more children could result from any delay in acting, while premature action might allow the conspirators to escape justice and continue their operations elsewhere. Between children's immediate safety and the broader goal of exposing the entire network faced Ellen an impossible choice. With Margaret Wilson's announcement of the most ambitious excursion yet, a month-long trip to historical biblical sites that would take 23 children as far as Philadelphia and possibly Boston, coincided Ellen's discovery of the evidence. The operation's final harvest before the conspirators disappeared with their accumulated profits was what Ellen realized this represented. The timing was no coincidence. An impossible choice faced the substitute teacher. Several men who owed their positions to Robert Hayes's political influence were included in local law enforcement, and considerable prestige in Cedar Creek's acclaimed educational program had been invested by the Methodist Church hierarchy. Skepticism at best and more likely with charges of slander that could destroy her career and credibility would be met by any accusation against such respected community figures. A cross-section of the community's most vulnerable families was represented by the children selected for the upcoming excursion. Names she had come to know during her months in Cedar Creek were recognized by Ellen, bright, trusting students who had grown to love their classes and looked forward to what they believed would be the adventure of their lifetimes. To disappear into the nightmare she had uncovered, she could not allow 23 more children. When Ellen realized that Sarah Coleman's supposed departure for medical treatment in Chicago was actually the beginning of the operation's final phase, came the decision to act. Exactly with the preparation for the largest transaction in the network's history corresponded the timing of her illness. It would be too late to prevent the systematic destruction of an entire generation of Cedar Creek's children if Ellen waited for more evidence or attempted to work through official channels. On March 28, 1878, Ellen Hartwell broke into the church basement one final time, not to gather evidence, but to steal it. The ledger, the correspondence, Sarah Coleman's journal, and every document that could prove the conspiracy's existence and scope were taken by her. That their disappearance would alert the conspirators to her discovery was known by her, but she hoped that documented proof would force authorities to act before the final excursion could depart. Both fortunate and tragic proved her timing. To accelerate the final excursion was Margaret Wilson's immediate response to the missing evidence, moving the departure date up by a full week and changing the announced destination to confuse any potential investigation. But events that would finally bring justice to Cedar Creek were set in motion by Ellen's desperate nighttime ride to the county seat in Noblesville, where she presented her evidence to Circuit Judge William Marshall. No room for doubt about the conspiracy's scope and horror was left by Judge Marshall's examination of Ellen's evidence. More importantly, coordinated raids that rescued 11 children before they could be permanently lost in the urban underworld resulted from his immediate telegrams to law enforcement in Chicago, Louisville, and other cities. That the network extended even further than Ellen's evidence had suggested, with connections to criminal organizations throughout the Midwest and beyond, was revealed by the rescue operations. Shock waves through Cedar Creek's Methodist community were sent by the arrest of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes on March 30, 1878. As they attempted to board a westbound train with substantial amounts of cash and forged travel documents, the three conspirators were taken into custody. A puzzle that had taken Ellen months to assemble was revealed the final pieces of by their capture. But with the realization that an entire town had somehow failed to notice the systematic disappearance of 50 children over 2 years came the deeper horror. The psychological manipulation that had made such massive deception possible was revealed by the subsequent investigation. For their circumstances had parents been carefully selected, recent immigrants, widows, families struggling financially, people who would be grateful for opportunities and reluctant to ask difficult questions. Any single dramatic event that might have triggered community alarm had been prevented by the gradual nature of the disappearances. That the conspirators had exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization was discovered by Detective Samuel Morrison of the Indiana State Police, who led the investigation following the arrests. Especially when presented with reasonable explanations for their absence, people naturally avoided discussing painful subjects like missing children. That allowed the crime to continue undetected had been a form of willful blindness in which the community had collectively participated. More disturbing still was the revelation that several community members had harbored private suspicions but had chosen to remain silent rather than challenge respected authority figures. At least 6 families who had noticed patterns or inconsistencies, but had convinced themselves that their concerns were unfounded or inappropriate, were uncovered by the investigation. An environment where even reasonable suspicions were suppressed had been created by the social pressure to maintain harmony and trust in church leadership. Institutional priorities that prioritized reputation over accountability were revealed by the Methodist Church hierarchy's response. Rather than conducting a thorough investigation of how such crimes could have occurred under church auspices, denominational leaders focused on containing the scandal and minimizing damage to the church's public image. Additional barriers to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy were created by this institutional response, and prevented implementation of safeguards that might have protected other communities. Particularly valuable in understanding how the operation had maintained its cover for so long proved Sarah Coleman's journal. Perfectly targeted explanations for each child's departure had been allowed to be crafted by the conspirators by her careful study of each family's dynamics. Parents with religious aspirations were told their children were pursuing advanced biblical studies, families struggling economically were assured their children were gaining valuable job skills, ambitious parents were convinced their children were making social connections that would benefit the entire family. That the Cedar Creek operation was just one node in a criminal network that had been operating across the Midwest for over a decade was revealed by the coordinated arrests across multiple states. Using identical methods and often involving the same network of criminal contacts in major cities discovered similar operations by law enforcement agencies in Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. That Margaret Wilson's background in Philadelphia had provided the initial connections for establishing the trafficking network was revealed by the investigation. Actually, involvement with criminal organizations that supplied child labor to factories and other enterprises willing to exploit vulnerable workers had been her supposed experience in industrial schools. A deliberate expansion of these operations into rural communities where oversight was minimal and trust was high had been her move to Cedar Creek. Crucial infrastructure for the network's operations had been provided by Robert Hayes's business connections. Legitimate reasons to travel frequently and maintain contact throughout the region had been given to him by his involvement in railroad shipping and grain trading. To move children across state lines without arousing suspicion from law enforcement or transportation officials had been used his warehouses and transportation arrangements. Far more wealth than their documented transactions suggested had been accumulated by the 3 conspirators, as revealed by the financial investigation. Hidden accounts, property purchases under false names, and complex financial arrangements indicated that over $50,000 in profits had been generated by the Cedar Creek operation, an enormous sum that placed the conspirators among the wealthiest individuals in Indiana. The expansion of their operations had been funded by this financial success and provided resources for corrupting officials and maintaining their cover. Beyond simple trafficking to encompass systematic corruption of law enforcement, political officials, and business leaders in multiple communities extended the network's reach. That substantial bribes had been paid to sheriffs, judges, and railroad officials to ensure cooperation and prevent investigation was discovered by the investigation. A protective umbrella that allowed the network to operate with impunity for years had been created by this corruption. Of the 50 children who had disappeared from Cedar Creek, only 18 were managed to be located and recovered by the coordinated rescue operations. Nearly impossible proved identifying most, as they had been so thoroughly integrated into industrial operations or domestic service. A secondary tragedy that haunted Cedar Creek for generations was created by the psychological trauma they had endured, which left many unable to readjust to normal family life. The systematic psychological warfare that had accompanied their physical exploitation was revealed by the rescued children's testimonies. They had been told that their families had sold them because they were unwanted burdens, that their suffering was punishment for unspecified sins, and that severe consequences for both themselves and their families would result from any attempt to escape or communicate with their former lives. Evidence of malnutrition, physical abuse, and exposure to dangerous working conditions that had caused permanent health problems was revealed by medical examinations of the recovered children. Signs of industrial accidents, missing fingers, respiratory problems from textile dust, and developmental delays from prolonged exposure to dangerous chemicals were shown by several children. Psychological damage that would require years of careful treatment to address was matched by the full scope of their physical suffering. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the children who initially resisted rescue efforts, having been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that their circumstances were normal and deserved, that their rescuers were legitimate and that they would not be punished for accepting help, had to be gradually convinced to several children. The criminal sophistication of the network's operations was demonstrated by the depth of psychological manipulation they had experienced. That at least 12 children had died while in the custody of their purchasers, victims of industrial accidents, disease, or abuse that would never be properly investigated or prosecuted, was also revealed by the investigation. Through falsified records and corrupt officials who ensured that no inconvenient questions were asked about the fate of children who had supposedly never existed in official documentation, these deaths had been covered up. A sensation throughout Indiana and beyond became the trials of Margaret Wilson, Sarah Coleman, and Robert Hayes. Not just the scope of their crimes, but the vulnerability that had made Cedar Creek such perfect hunting grounds for criminal exploitation was laid bare by the prosecution's presentation of evidence. Devastating evidence of the conspiracy's impact was provided by the testimony of rescued children, presented with careful attention to their psychological fragility. To portray her as a misguided idealist who had believed she was providing opportunities for disadvantaged children was attempted by Margaret Wilson's defense. When prosecutors presented evidence of her detailed financial records and correspondence with criminal contacts that demonstrated clear awareness of the illegal nature of her activities, this strategy collapsed. A calculating individual who had exploited religious faith and parental love for purely financial gain was revealed by her final testimony. More difficult to prosecute under existing legal frameworks proved Sarah Coleman's psychological manipulation. While her role in conditioning children and deceiving families was clearly documented, not well understood by legal authorities in 1878 was the subtle nature of psychological abuse. That her care for the children had been genuine, even if misguided, was argued by her defense, but her criminal intent was ultimately convinced to the jury by the evidence of systematic emotional manipulation. On his role in financing and facilitating the operation focused Robert Hayes's trial. That his business activities had been legitimate and that any involvement with the trafficking network had been unknowing was argued by his attorneys. However, his central role in planning and executing the conspiracy was demonstrated by the financial evidence and correspondence. The longest prison sentence of the three conspirators resulted from his conviction on multiple counts of conspiracy and trafficking. Significant gaps in existing laws regarding child trafficking and exploitation were also revealed by the legal proceedings. Various fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy statutes that were not specifically designed to address systematic trafficking operations had to be relied on by the prosecution. Weaknesses in law enforcement coordination that would not be adequately addressed for decades were exposed by the complexity of interstate criminal activity. Institutional priorities that placed reputation management above accountability and victim support were revealed by the Methodist Church's response to the scandal. Rather than conducting a comprehensive investigation of how such crimes could have occurred under church auspices, denominational leaders focused on damage control and distancing themselves from the Cedar Creek operation. That the crimes had been perpetrated by individuals who had deceived the church as thoroughly as they had deceived the community was argued by church officials. While technically accurate, This response ignored the institutional failures that had enabled the conspiracy to operate undetected. The lack of oversight, the absence of verification procedures for educational programs, and the culture of unquestioning trust in authority figures had all contributed to creating an environment where such crimes could flourish. Additional trauma for the affected community was created by the church's refusal to implement systematic reforms or provide support for victims' families. Abandoned by the institution they had trusted with their most precious possessions, felt parents who had lost children. The sense that their children's suffering had been meaningless and that nothing had been learned from the tragedy was reinforced by the lack of institutional accountability. Equally significant were local law enforcement's failures. That multiple reports and concerns had been dismissed without proper investigation over the 2-year period of the conspiracy's operation was revealed by Sheriff Thomas Bradley's investigation. A perfect environment for criminal exploitation had been created by the combination of political corruption, professional incompetence, and social pressure to avoid challenging respected community figures. For their role in enabling the conspiracy, also escaped accountability did the railroad companies whose infrastructure had been used to transport children across state lines. While their employees' cooperation had been purchased through bribes rather than corporate policy, the trafficking operation had been facilitated by the lack of oversight and verification procedures for passenger transportation. No significant changes in transportation security or verification procedures resulted from the investigation. A hero to some and a pariah to others within the Cedar Creek community was made by Ellen Hartwell's role in exposing the conspiracy. For destroying the town's reputation and bringing unwanted attention to their community blamed her many residents. Impossible to continue living in Cedar Creek was made for her by the social pressure and hostility she faced in the aftermath of the trials. For the rest of her life, Ellen was haunted by the psychological burden of her discovery and its aftermath. From immediate trafficking, she had saved 23 children, but the 32 who had already disappeared into the criminal network could not be saved by her. A sense of guilt that no amount of rational analysis could eliminate was created by the knowledge that her earlier action might have prevented additional disappearances. Significant damage from her involvement in the case was suffered by Ellen's professional career. As a troublemaker who had violated professional norms by investigating her colleagues and superiors was how many educational institutions viewed her. Resistance from administrators who preferred traditional approaches based on trust and personal relationships was often met by her attempts to implement safeguards and verification procedures in subsequent positions. Beyond professional consequences to encompass social isolation and psychological trauma extended the personal cost of her heroism. Partly because potential suitors were deterred by her association with the scandal, and partly because her experience had made her profoundly suspicious of people's motivations and claims, Ellen never married. Between different teaching positions, she spent the remainder of her career, never staying long enough to form the deep community connections that might have exposed her to similar betrayals. Despite these personal costs, throughout her career, Ellen continued to advocate for educational reforms and child protection measures. The importance of institutional oversight, verification procedures, and systematic monitoring of educational programs was emphasized by her writings and speeches. While her specific recommendations were rarely implemented during her lifetime, gradual improvements in educational standards and child protection policies were contributed to by her advocacy. Lasting impacts that extended far beyond the immediate community were had by the Cedar Creek scandal. National awareness of child trafficking issues and the vulnerability of rural communities to criminal exploitation was created by news coverage of the trials and investigation. However, the long-term benefits of this increased awareness were limited by the lack of systematic follow-up and institutional reform. Denominational policies regarding educational programs and oversight procedures were influenced by the Methodist denomination's handling of the scandal. While no comprehensive reforms were implemented immediately, gradually increased scrutiny of church-sponsored activities involving children was contributed to by the embarrassment and legal liability associated with the Cedar Creek case. Similar large-scale operations in other Methodist communities may have been prevented by these changes, while incremental. Severe and long-lasting was the financial impact on Cedar Creek. Leading to reduced business investment and population decline was the town's reputation as a safe and respectable community, permanently damaged. Unable to remain in a place associated with such profound trauma, many families who had lost children left the area entirely. Cedar Creek's gradual decline from a prosperous industrial center to a struggling rural community was contributed to by the economic consequences of the scandal. As a catalyst for improved coordination and information sharing used the Cedar Creek case by law enforcement agencies in multiple states. The inadequacy of state and local authorities in addressing interstate criminal activity had been revealed by the investigation. While significant improvements in law enforcement coordination would not occur until the early 20th century, important precedents for federal involvement in interstate crimes were provided by the Cedar Creek case. Based on their individual circumstances and the support they received from their families and communities varied significantly the rescued children's long-term outcomes. While others struggled with lasting psychological and physical damage from their experiences, some managed to rebuild their lives and achieve relative normalcy. Largely dependent on family resources and individual resilience was recovery, meant by the lack of systematic support services for trafficking victims. To determine the ultimate fate of all 50 missing children attempted a follow-up investigation 20 years after the arrests. Sobering were the results. 18 had been rescued and returned to their families, 12 had been confirmed dead through various means, and 20 remained missing with no reliable information about their whereabouts or condition. That most of the missing children had likely died in industrial accidents, from disease, or as a result of abuse was concluded by the investigation, but definitive conclusions were made impossible by the lack of documentation. That the conspirators' total profits from the operation had exceeded $75,000 was revealed by the financial investigation, an enormous sum that placed them among the wealthiest criminals in American history. Having been hidden in accounts and investments that could not be traced through the limited investigative techniques available in the 1870s, most of this money was never recovered. Minimal compensation was received by the victims' families, and many remained in poverty for the rest of their lives. In prison in 1884 died Margaret Wilson, having served only 6 years of her 20-year sentence. In 1885, due to poor health, was released Sarah Coleman and disappeared entirely with no reliable records of her subsequent whereabouts or activities. 12 years were served by Robert Hayes and he was released in 1890, eventually moving to California, where he lived under an assumed name until his death in 1903. Depending on their level of involvement and the effectiveness of local prosecution efforts, faced varying fates the network's other participants. By fleeing to territories where law enforcement was minimal, escaped justice entirely some, while others received light sentences that reflected the limited understanding of trafficking crimes at the time. That the full scope of the network was never completely mapped or dismantled was meant by the lack of coordination between different jurisdictions. Yet the lessons of Cedar Creek remain painfully relevant to our modern world, though more than a century has passed since these events unfolded. How easily trusted institutions can become vehicles for systematic evil when adequate oversight and accountability measures are absent is demonstrated by the Cedar Creek case. On exploiting natural human tendencies to trust authority figures and avoid confronting uncomfortable truths depended the conspirators' success, not on elaborate deception. By a community's willingness to accept convenient explanations rather than ask difficult questions were their crimes facilitated. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the trafficking operation succeeded not because of extraordinary criminal genius, but because of ordinary human failings, greed, willful blindness, and the desire to believe that authority figures are inherently trustworthy. Careful planning and execution were required by the systematic nature of the crimes, but in many communities where people prefer comfort to vigilance exist the underlying conditions that made them possible. The vulnerability of children to authority figures who exploit their natural trust and desire for approval is revealed by the psychological manipulation employed by Sarah Coleman. By modern standards were not particularly sophisticated her techniques, but they were devastatingly effective against children who had been taught to respect and obey adult authority without question. Into a tool for ensuring their compliance and silence was perverted the religious framework that should have protected these children. Both the power of individual moral action and the personal costs that such action often entails is illustrated by Ellen Hartwell's courage in exposing the conspiracy. The kind of moral courage that society desperately needs but rarely rewards adequately is demonstrated by her willingness to risk her career and personal safety to protect children she barely knew. How difficult it can be to challenge established systems even when they harbor terrible secrets is revealed by the hostility she faced from her own community. If you've stayed with this story until now, you're clearly someone who isn't afraid to confront the darkest chapters of our history. That sometimes one person's willingness to act can save countless lives is reminded to us by the courage shown by Ellen Hartwell. What would you have done in her situation? Would you have had the bravery to investigate when everyone else was looking away? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button. For more tales that uncover the secrets hidden in America's religious history, don't forget to subscribe. Questions that remain relevant today are raised by the Cedar Creek tragedy. How can communities protect vulnerable populations without becoming paralyzed by suspicion? What institutional safeguards can prevent the exploitation of trust while preserving the social cooperation that makes community life possible? How should society balance the presumption of innocence for authority figures against the need to protect those under their care? Many lessons learned from cases like Cedar Creek are incorporated by modern child protection systems, but as technology and social organization evolve, new forms of exploitation continue to emerge. The fundamental human vulnerabilities that the conspirators exploited, parental aspirations, economic desperation, and deference to authority, remain unchanged, creating ongoing challenges for those responsible for protecting children and other vulnerable populations. In contemporary scandals involving religious organizations, educational institutions, and other trusted entities continue to manifest the institutional failures revealed in the Cedar Creek case: inadequate oversight, resistance to accountability measures, and prioritization of reputation over victim welfare. The specific methods may change, but disturbingly consistent across different eras and contexts remain the underlying patterns of institutional self-protection and victim abandonment. Perhaps from Cedar Creek is that preventing such tragedies requires active vigilance rather than passive trust, the most important lesson. Not because she possessed extraordinary abilities, but because she insisted on documentation, verification, and accountability when others were content to accept reassuring explanations, succeeded Ellen Hartwell's investigation. That protecting vulnerable populations requires ordinary people to ask uncomfortable questions and demand satisfactory answers is demonstrated by her example. How the most trusted institutions can harbor the darkest secrets and how easily we can become complicit in evil through our willingness to believe comfortable lies is shown by this mystery. What do you think of this story? Do you believe an entire community could truly forget 50 missing children? Or were there others who knew and chose to remain silent? Were Margaret Wilson and her accomplices monsters or ordinary people corrupted by opportunity and greed? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how such tragedies can be prevented in our own time. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden horror and want more stories that uncover America's darkest religious secrets, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge what we think we know about the past. That vigilance is the price of protecting the innocent, and that sometimes the greatest evil comes disguised as the greatest good is reminded to us by the truth about Cedar Creek. See you in the next video.